everybody, you're listening to the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Billy Z.
I'm Steve Morey.
We've been very busy. We both went to Heroes Con, and we actually met up at Heroes Con with our other co-host, Brian, and our former co-host, Matt. So this was the biggest CBB gathering ever. This is the first time we've had four of us together. And we want to talk to you about that, but we naturally don't want to do it without Brian. And he wasn't able to record tonight. And actually, we were supposed to be guesting on another podcast tonight that got pushed to tomorrow night. But with the schedules that we have had, I mean, for myself, I'm going to be working in Minneapolis for 2 months. And the prep for that was, completely swallowed up the last 2 or 3 days for me. Just wanted to make sure, especially with this being Pride Month, that we got at least one episode out to you. But Steve and I are free for about 90 minutes, so we figured we'll get on the mic and talk about stuff. No real agenda on the episode tonight, beyond us talking about our first Pride experiences. We figured that was something that I know there are gay people who have never been to a Pride event, but we figured that was something that we both have stories that, orbit around that. And I think that's something that most people can relate to that listen to this show. I certainly know a number of people who are straight allies, the one who has probably gone to more Pride events than I have. Would you say that's the same for you, Steve? Or?
Yeah. Actually, we do have a lot of ally friends, straight friends and couples who, are out there every year with their kids, supporting the parade route and just wearing rainbows. Just, it's really heartening. And at the same time, I'm like, oh man, I haven't been to a Pride in a while. These guys are better than I am.
Yeah, and there was something just for this year in particular. It was really great seeing, particularly on Facebook, so many straight allies who had the, Pride circular around their. I don't know. There was just something about this year. I mean, because I think we are at probably peak commercialization of Pride, or at least as much as we've seen it. And that's something I don't ever want to get cynical about, because if it's not there, you'll feel it.
Well, and I mean,
Yeah.
I was thinking about this because obviously that's been a major topic this year of debate where, corporate branding or Pride branding is sort of a mixed bag of messages. So you'll have, of course, these large corporate sponsors like Nike or McDonald's or whoever, that you could think about, with Rainbow Pride branded whatever commercials, whether they're their Facebook or Twitter pages or some kind of special promotional thing that they're putting out for the month that has a rainbow on it. I mean, it seems kind of cynical almost. It's a lot of people kind of consider it as a cash grab, like, look, buy my stuff, gay people. But at the same time, I mean, just think about it 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The number of companies that would have ever come out and publicly done any kind of support of Pride, whether it's something as simple as putting out a one-page ad in a magazine with a rainbow on it, or a we support our LGBTQ, etc., fans or customers or employees or anything. You could probably count on one hand. I mean, Absolute Vodka was up there as one of the earlier.
That's the first one I remember.
Yeah,
From what I understand, the first company that did that was Benetton, but I never saw that. Not that I'm looking for Benetton ads, but
yeah.
But the first one I think that most people remember was the Absolute Pride ad for Absolute Vodka.
Yeah, and I mean they've since then they've supported prides all over the world. They've also been a sponsor of RuPaul's Drag Race. I mean they've remained a visible ally, not just during June, but at other times of the year. That's not really the case with most other companies. But just because they're not visibly supportive does not necessarily mean that they're, only in it for a 30-day cash grab. Because a lot of these same companies that also, that have the in-your-face branding and buy my stuff because I like gay people, they've also internally changed a lot of their employee and human resource policies to be more supportive and inclusive and safer places to work for LGBTQ employees. It's not to say that they also don't have other, skeletons in their closet. I was listening to another podcast, um, and they were talking about some of the sort of the issues where even top rated companies by HRC's annual survey still may give donations to anti-trans, anti-LGBT um, politicians or political campaigns. So it's not something that they necessarily look at. They look at specific like bills if they're supporting a particular bill that's anti-gay or anti-trans, but not necessarily politicians. So it's like you might have a high score, but also locally in Minneapolis, you're supporting a politician who is against equal marriage or is against protection for trans youth or trans people. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff that still needs to improve. But I mean, where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago in terms of visibility, like even a cynical cash grab, that would have been unheard of. Like Reebok wouldn't have put a rainbow flag on their shoes and said, yeah, we like gay people. Like nobody would have said that.
Right. And it wouldn't be uncommon to see some of those companies have their employees under the company banner marching in a parade. It just didn't extend to outward advertising, at least on the scale that we're seeing now. And
exactly.
It is also, to me, it's amazing seeing some of the companies that used to have horrendous reputations as anti-gay, like Coors Light, and this week, the one that knocked me out, Cracker Barrel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Cracker Barrel. I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for like in the next couple of years for Chick-fil-A with a rainbow package or rainbow bag for June. Which if that happened, I'm sure a vast swath of people's heads would explode.
If that happens, we're all gay.
Yeah, it's like we're all gay at that point. It's like if you eat a Chick-fil-A, you like the penis. You like it's just I can imagine that would go over in a very interesting way, and I'd love to see that situation. I mean, people talk about like political, this politician did this, or if this policy passes, or if the Equality Act passes, then there'll be civil war. Oh no. The real civil war would happen if you can get your waffle fries in rainbow colors.
Can I tell you about my favorite commercialization story of recent time? I went to see Cher with my partner a couple months ago, like a month and a half ago about. And, they always have the T-shirt hawkers outside the venue, with the bootleg T-shirts for the bigger shows. At least they do by me. I don't know how it is by you.
Yeah.
And this one guy had a bunch of leftover pride flags, and he was hawking them as Cher flags.
What?
Yes. I was like, I tip my hat off to him. That's you got product, you got to move it somehow. So I really dug that.
He got his audience, I guess.
Yeah. All right, so let's get on track there. So, Steve, son, what was your first Pride?
Well, I was kind of late in getting to Pride, and this is really funny because, of course, after I came out, I was in a very gay-friendly city, so I had no problems walking around holding hands with my boyfriend at the time. PDA, all that, I felt comfortable. But in going to an actual Pride, I was living in Connecticut for a little while after I graduated college, and I didn't feel like driving all the way to Boston, driving all the way to New York to actually experience something. So my first Pride actually came, I believe it was 2007. Here in, well, not here in Charlotte. I live in Winston now, but when I was in Charlotte at the time. But it was a very interesting time to go to Pride because Charlotte, at that point, they had a Pride parade for a couple years in a row, but Charlotte at the time was an extremely conservative city, or at least it was still fighting back against the extremely conservative and Bible Belt evangelical reputation and history. So in 2007, I believe it was 2007, they, instead of allowing or having a pride parade or something that was very public and open, instead they decided to have a pride in the courtyard of the Bank of America complex. So it's still technically outside, but there was really only like one way in, so you had to like basically check in with everything and go through security, and it was not visible from the outside. So, outside, the only way that you knew it was Pride is one, a bunch of queers walking together and going inside, and two, the small clusters of loud evangelical protesters with megaphones who were talking about going to hell and you're damned for all eternity and God hates gays and all of that. So that's the only way from the outside that you knew it was Pride. And then, of course, once you got into the courtyard, there were booths from a lot of different groups. There were, youth shelter representation. There was representation from the Leatherman and from the Eagle. All of the gay owned and operated businesses in the city and around Charlotte. And it was great seeing the crowds. You still had allies and their families. You had young people who were dressing up and expressing themselves. But it was still kind of a weird feeling that, here's Pride, where, the purpose is to not just celebrate who you are, but also basically say to the world, the old adage, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going anywhere. Get used to it. It was kind of the reverse of that. It was, hey, we're here, we're queer, we're just going to be over here in the corner. Like, don't worry, don't mind us, and in that, and, we discussed it afterwards. And again, it's kind of hard to say because the organizers a really great job in creating this wonderful space that was a very safe space, but also a very, celebratory space. We had, there were gospel choruses, there were, performers, they had a big stage, that they were having performances throughout the day and the weekend. But overall, it was almost like a shameful Pride. It was we could be great and out and open amongst ourselves, but we really, we don't think that our message of acceptance and, and celebratory pride of ourselves is going to be something that we can show outwardly, to the rest of the city, which was, again, very strange. But that did not last long. Within a few years, the parade was back. And since then, it has gotten larger and larger every year, with a lot more involvement with the major businesses in town. Charlotte's a big banking town. Bank of America's there. Wachovia was there for a while, and now it's Wells Fargo, of course. We've got BB&T. There's a lot of major banking corporations, but there's also IBM. We've got a lot of other businesses that are that call the city home. And are very vocal now. I mean, we're talking about corporate sponsorship and representation. Maybe 10 years ago, we would have had a small group of employees with a little flag saying, the employees of Bank of America. Now it's like, here's the big banner and here's a whole bunch of, not just the LGBT employees, but then also ally employees and everything. And it's like Bank of America supports, Charlotte Pride or, and it's changed so much. And yes, those people with the megaphones are still there, but now the parade, the allies, the supporters, and the celebration drown them out, which is what the purpose of Pride really is, to drown out the negativity and really embrace the joy of who we are, and also to make sure the message is clear. We are here. This is not, we're not going to go away. We're not going to hide in the shadows. And unfortunately, my first Pride in Charlotte was almost like that. It was like the opposite of Pride, which, again, not to say anything about the supporter, the people who organized it, they did the best they could given the circumstances. But since then, it's changed completely. I mean, there's like the Pride band. It's huge. It's huge in Charlotte, which is great.
Yeah, with my first Pride, it ties into my very long coming out process. I came out when I was 30, and I came out to close friends and some family. Um, and I came out as bisexual, and then I promptly ended up dating a woman for 4 months.
Mhm.
So I think there was this sense among some people of like, oh, that Bill, you know, he's still confused. So that would have been in 1997. And over the next few years, I gradually, you know, I still identify as bisexual. I don't know if that's an outgrowth of me not wanting to invalidate relationships I had before, because I do
Mhm.
think they were. I do think there was legitimacy to them. There may have been some degree of illegitimacy that I could not overcome or
Mm.
be fully aware of, but uh, I think it's a disservice to the girls I dated, the disservice to myself too. There was something very real about most of them, and I don't want to invalidate that. So
Yeah.
whenever I'm called on the carpet, I still say bisexual. Though at this point, I just, I get turned on by women every so often.
Mhm.
I think on this show, or maybe it was the movie Bears, talked about Amber Heard and the mirror outfit. But hey, sometimes those gears still turn. Uh, but for the the second half of my life, let's put it that way, I've lived as a gay man.
Mhm.
Um, I started dating my partner in early 2002, and there was a sense in New York. I lived much closer to the city at the time than I do right now, and the the sense of sadness that was brought on by 9/11.
Mhm.
That's I think something that has been taken away from most historical accounts of what the city was like after 9/11. The level of sadness that was there was it was so overwhelming, and even if you started enjoying yourself, there was a sense of guilt tied to
Um.
that because you had people that you knew couldn't engage in behavior like that.
Mhm.
Um, I lost two close friends and possibly 6 or 7 acquaintances,
Wow.
that I would, yeah, and I think most people that had, at least some degree of a social life could say the same if you were living there weren't people that I was close to at the time, but, one certainly close enough to go to their funeral.
Yeah.
Um, and that was a shared experience for many, many, many people. And Rob and I got together in that atmosphere. The first time we met in late 2001 was the first time he had gone out and the first time I had gone out at post 9/11. So I tie my first Pride a lot into that experience. And again, as I said, the first Pride I went to was in 2002, and that was the first time I felt that I was out as a gay man truly. Um,
Mhm.
and at that point I had met some people, had struck up some friendships. Uh, to this day, the majority of my friends are straight. Just because that's who I hung out with in my late teens and early 20s. Um, but that was the first time where I'm like, oh, I've seen him at the bar before. It was, you know what I mean? It was like the
Yeah.
first time it was the first time I really felt community. And
Mhm.
I've always been dealing with this not gay enough bullshit, that I hear a lot. It's you like football, whatever. It's like, I've had a dick up my ass. That's pretty fucking gay to me. All right. Um,
Yep. Yep. Pretty gay.
yeah. So
Not
that,
exclusively. Not exclusively. But yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if you ever hear that from guys, you're not gay enough. I'm talking to Caleb. It's bullshit. Uh, so by the time Pride rolled around in June of 2002, I think there was enough distance from the 9/11 attacks that people did not feel the guilt and the sadness that I was talking about. And there was this kind of atmosphere of, okay, we've made it. We've made it to this point. Um, there was a moment though with the within the proceedings. It was around 2 p.m. I think it was exactly at 2 p.m. where the parade came to a halt, and participating churches would toll a bell for 30 seconds for everyone who had been lost to AIDS. I don't know if that's a practice that still goes on in New York, but it's something when you're in a crowd of people and things stop dead. And that was also a reality check as well of contending with that experience and feeling that that there is as you said, that there's purpose behind this. Um, right now we have the second season of Pose happening, and that um, the terrain that they're covering and the time period is, at the height of ACT UP, and really the height of the deaths
Hmm.
of the plague of AIDS. Um,
And actually, it was interesting because I was thinking about that same thing. Obviously, they haven't talked about it on Pose and whether they'll talk about it in the season or not. The feeling in New York post 9/11. I'm wondering, how pride parades in the city were handled during the height of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. Were they equally as somber or had, more of a.
I think from reports from friends, again, I worked in theater from 1991 to 1994. So I was always in a very friendly atmosphere, and very much in touch. And I think that there was it was celebratory mixed with defiance.
Hmm.
Um, just going from the accounts of two people that I knew. Um, I'm sure that that's how most people would characterize that. And now that I'm thinking of it, it's like I never went to Pride, but I can't tell you how many Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS events I went to.
Yeah.
Certainly double digits.
Hmm.
Um, and you had to because your contemporaries were dying.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of the first wave of people when I first started working in the business end of Broadway theater, and there's at least three names that I can think of that by 96 or 97 were gone. Um,
Hmm.
you know. Um, so that was my first Pride, was 2002, and that kind of that lit something inside of me. Uh, and this is weird because I hate that it's so trite that it's tied to a comic book, but if I can't talk about it here, where can I talk about it?
Hey, it's
Um,
just comic book bears after all.
yeah.
So
So
yeah.
later, yeah. So later in the year, there was an arc in Green Lantern. At the time, Green Lantern was still Kyle Rayner, where the guy that he had hired as his assistant, remember Kyle Rayner, was, how did they characterize it? Was he a cartoonist, or was he just an art, like an advertising artist? I'm trying to remember just how.
I,
Anyway, he was
yeah.
successful enough to have an assistant, and his assistant was an openly gay man. And this particular arc, which was called Hate Crime, which is part of a larger arc called Brothers Keeper, um, dealt with his assistant being the victim of a gay bashing. And it's not the most well crafted story. And it's good people behind it, Judd Winnick and Dave Eaglesham. I think because it was such new terrain for comic books, for commercial comic books, that um, it was almost, there were some elements that I thought were handled a little too delicately. Though certainly Jim Lee's cover of Kyle's friend beaten up was pretty striking, and
Mm.
was an example before it was completely eradicated, where the Comics Code seal was not on the cover. Um, I think DC was still part of that at that point, but I don't want to put hands of Bible on that.
Mm.
And the story was well crafted enough, though, that it affected me to the point where I wanted people to know who they were dealing with. Um, and I became very open at work. That was my way of dealing with that, where I wasn't playing the pronoun game anymore. And the funniest experience, though, was um, Rob was staying down with me at home, and my one of my two bosses, Tom Novak, it's just because he's just like this like Jersey Goomba guy,
Mm-hmm.
who made good and became a partner at a law firm, but he's still very, hey, how you doing, that kind of personality. And I was nervous about coming out to him, and I didn't realize that he had called home and Rob had picked up while I was gone, like a month before this happened. And so he was like, "Yeah, I talked to your partner. I talked to your boyfriend. He's cool." So I had no idea about this for a couple months. Um, and some people had, I don't want to say negative reactions, but it was one person felt slighted that they weren't honest, that I wasn't honest to them,
Yeah.
which was not the reaction I was expecting. Um, One guy was like, yeah. And then there was also the onslaught of, there was this one time in college where I felt like, a priest in a confessional, where people are telling me their stories. Um, but it was this like comic book story that set me off to a path of much more openness about my sexuality. And, for the last few years, I work for a very big company at this point, and I don't want to say it's advantageous to be out, but given the number of business resource groups that we have that are LGBT oriented, on Wednesday we're presenting one of the Stonewall films for lunch break, and you can't get a seat
Hmm.
in the auditorium, which is fantastic, and that's not all gay people. Um,
Hopefully it's not the most recent, very fictionalized Stonewall movie that you
oh
got.
no, 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 it's not. It's one of the recent
Oh,
documentaries.
good, good, good.
I'm not sure if it's the one we saw on Sunday.
Hmm.
Yes, folks, sorry, we were together on Sunday. One of the more recent ones.
Yeah.
I'm just glad I went down that path. I really am, because I think it's still it's common among certain people my age to not be fully out.
Yeah.
And
And you still see that, if you do dating apps or if you're, out at a, excuse me, out at a bar, in many parts of the South, especially, because my experience here in the South is pretty much, uh, you have a lot of those people who are not out publicly or not out to their families, but, they go to another city they hang out at the bar and meet people and, have great lives, but dual lives still. And, for it being 2019, it's still kind of hard to imagine that, it's not more difficult to try and maintain this kind of secret life with so many people coming out and, it being very acceptable in many areas. But again, I think being out, we kind of have that strange privilege where we can't really imagine being back in the closet
yeah.
at this
Oh, I
at this
couldn't
stage.
imagine what that would be like. The
Yeah,
only conception I have is if you were in a foreign country and just laid low for a bit.
yeah.
That's the only time where I think that would affect me.
Hmm.
I don't know what Minneapolis is going to be like, but
Yeah. Well,
well,
it
I
starts
was
to be
also
like
reading
that.
Minneapolis is has one of the highest gay populations
It
of
does. It
American
does in
cities.
the Midwest,
Yeah,
especially. Yeah.
yeah. All right, well,
So.
boys, I'm coming. So let you know. So that's my pride and my sort of second coming out story. So
Awesome.
yeah, yeah. So what else do you want to talk about? We've got some time. We got to get an episode out. So
Well, we were kind of talking about it, and I think, hearing your story about the Green Lantern story arc about the, with the gay bashing. It kind of brought back memories of what comics that I was reading at around the same time, maybe a few years before, obviously, that were, I wouldn't say instrumental in my understanding of the community or gay culture, but comics that I was reading where I can identify with the characters because they were openly gay or written as openly gay. And strangely enough, I was like, what books were those? And I know we've talked about in a previous episode, like which comics with gay characters that we really, that we first saw or first read, or particular characters. Mine, strangely enough, were the lesbian couple, Foxglove and Hazel from Sandman. And thinking back on their, on the big story arcs where they were, where they were main characters. Sorry, had to mute. Where they were main characters was the Sandman story arc of A Game of You, which ostensibly was about a community featuring some of the same people from A Doll's House a few years previously, but a community of people living together that were essentially brought into one of the characters, Barbie's dream world, with her quest with the cuckoo and the hierophant and the gosh, I forget the name of the talisman, but just it was a crazy story where a lot of these people were brought in and forced to confront this fantasy world in the dreaming. And of course, you had Foxglove and her girlfriend Hazel. You also had a trans woman, Wanda, which is probably one of the first trans characters that I'd ever read in a comic book. And actually, there's a great scene towards the end of the book, and I do want to make sure everybody reads the Sandman books at least once, all the way through. Game of You is I know it's not a lot of people's favorite volume, but it does have some really great moments. And one of them is where Rose Walker, one of the characters, the trans character Wanda, ends up dying in the process of completing the quest. And as she's being laid to rest, her family, who never accepted her as Wanda, has dressed her up as her previous, as she was previously as Alan or Alvin or something. And Rose is like, this is, or not Rose, Barbie, sorry. Barbie, goes to the funeral and is really disgusted because this is not her friend. Her friend is not this man. Her friend has always been a woman. And so after the funeral's over, she vandalizes the tombstone and puts Alvin's, crosses out Alvin's name and puts Wanda. And that's very powerful because that's, in terms of, representation, obviously you have Foxglove and Hazel there as sort of the lesbian couple, who are having a shared life together. And of course they go on and have a family, they have a son. And of course all the problems that come with that in a future Death spinoff book. But having a trans character there and having, a very clear representation of an ally who, wants to make sure that, in death as in life, they're recognized for who they are. And that's just a powerful little message. It's a very quick scene towards the end, but it is very interesting to see something like that. And I believe this was written in, I want to say like the early 90s. So for something like that, to be in a mainstream published book, and, I know a lot of people were saying, okay, Vertigo wasn't necessarily, considered mainstream, but it is published by DC. And of course it is, it is the publishing house, the publishing division that really introduced a lot of people to independent comics, including myself, that may have been big two readers. This is really powerful. And so, seeing characters like that being so well written, And I was reading this in high school, so obviously years before it came out because I didn't come out until 2001. But the 90s where I was a teenager, um, through the 90s. Yeah, yeah. Um, but reading this was really great because here I was seeing realistic characters. Obviously, the situation wasn't realistic, but seeing realistic characters being written lovingly by the author, not being used as foils for derision or for humor. Um, even though these characters did experience like some of them were humorous, some of them were really multifaceted. They weren't caricatures, and that was pretty powerful for me. And then since then, obviously, I'd read a lot of other, queer comics, ostensibly queer comics or comics with queer characters. But that stands out as sort of like the first time that I read something where it was, it was just circumstantial that these characters were queer, but it was treated as quote unquote normal. And even though the situation wasn't, how they interacted with each other was how I kind of wanted to have a community in the future. I wanted a community like that where people were there for each other regardless of who they were, who they loved, and how they expressed themselves. So yeah,
I go a little bit farther back
going
with
back, do it again. Sorry.
yeah, don't do that. I go back a little farther because I'm as old as sand, and um, few years before that, I would say the comic books where there was gay content that kind of spoke to me. Even though we had gay elements in stories like Camelot 3000 and Watchmen, there was
Hmm.
still a salacious edge to it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
even if it was gay positive or believed itself to be gay positive, there was a titillation factor. Um, and I have a feeling that some of those creators would be the first to say that at this point in the game.
Well, wasn't that a sort of like a big way to most gay comics in like the 70s and early 80s that were queer published, queer subjects, weren't they a lot of times kind of salacious? They were
Yeah,
sex comics and
yeah,
but just
those
out
as well.
there.
But yeah, so the first time that there was gay content where, and in both cases, there's kind of like a matter of factness that feeds into it, and I think that's why there was appeal. Um, the first one that I can remember vividly, and I'm not sure if I have because they were like so close in time. I, you know what, the Maggie story must have been before the Secret Six, but I'll tell you about both of them. Uh, in the when people hear the name Secret Six, they I think nowadays think of the Gail Simone helmed series, the one pre New 52 and the one that came out in the New 52 years. The original Secret Six was a series in the 60s with this international espionage unit who were given these missions by an entity known as Mockingbird, and one of the six was Mockingbird, but nobody knew who it was. And it was a short-lived series. It only lasted 7 issues. They attempted a revival of it when Action Comics became Action Comics Weekly. And there was a beautiful moment with one of the characters. I don't want to put hand to Bible on the character's name, but I think his name was Luke McKendrick. Throughout the stories, you're getting these nuggets of what the six characters' lives were like before they became members of the Secret Six. And there was a moment where, again, I believe it was Luke, that Luke was at the grave of his former lover, and as like what effectively would be a pan backwards if it were a film, you see that it was a man. There wasn't any like ridiculous like North Star yelling I'm gay, it wasn't anything along those lines. It was a simple, subtle moment, which, in by my estimation, said volumes. And it's written by Marty Pasco, I think, is a really, really underrated writer. Um, just he should be in some Hall of Fame just for his Blackhawk stories in the '80s alone. Um, and also this was the same artist that he had, Dan Spiegel, so there was kind of like there was some connective tissue between the two series. Uh, and if it had continued, I imagine you would have actually seen that connective tissue in full. But there was something about that of a who cares element that really spoke to me because that's how it should be. Um, Not that you shouldn't care that some guy had a lover who died, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I
like
hope I'm not up.
the
Yeah,
gender of the characters really
it,
is, obviously it's important to the
it's
story, but
yeah, but
the fact that
it
they
doesn't
are, yeah.
matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Just that
Yeah.
this character had a love who's now gone. Um, the Maggie Sawyer, which I must have predated this, but again, the '80s. I had a good time, so this is a little bit of a jumble there. Um, though I do have a fantastic memory for some things. Um, the Maggie Sawyer reveal, where you find out that she's a lesbian, came from a story in one of the Superman annuals, and Terrible Turpin, who's a cop that works under her, is basically going to her place to ask her out on a date. And that's where he finds her sunbathing with her lover. And they cut forward to the next day where they're at work, and Maggie just basically lays it on the line and says, "Come on, Turpin, we got work to do." And it was just such a there was a sweetness to it, in that now you know me, now you know who I am. Let's get to work, and this is how we're going to operate. And that was a Byrne written and drawn story. It really was the late '80s where I think you saw more positive and again like less titillating um,
Mhm.
gay elements in comics. There's, again, the stories that I mentioned were both from DC. DC also had some potholes. Mainly a character named Extraño, from the New Guardians, which is,
Yes.
just should not have been. Uh, but I honestly think there were good intentions, even with that series, by having two of the characters be HIV positive. I think there was a good intention there, but the execution was just clunky as hell.
Yeah.
Um, because Extraño fed into so many of the stereotypes uh, that that I think elements of our community, even if they embrace them, don't want to be bound by them. Um, uh, but anyway, that's my counterpart to your game of you. And from just a non-gay standpoint, everybody should read Sandman sometime in their life.
Oh gosh,
I
yeah.
really do feel that. I think the one problem with that is the first volume, Fables and Reflections. I can understand people bailing because
Yeah.
it's not the most effective volume. Once you get to A Doll's House, very early on, the second arc, A Doll's House for me was just mind blowing.
Oh,
And
yeah. I mean, when
yeah,
you start reading, and that actually was not funny enough.
yeah,
I didn't start Sandman at the beginning. I basically came
really.
in during the World's End arc.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Boy,
Well, I
oh
mean,
boy.
think of the time period. Like, it was
Yeah.
1993, 94 when I was picking up those books. And World's End was actually, in terms of storytelling, since it was an anthology, essentially, like they had the bookends at the inn, at the, at the tavern, at the inn, at the end of the world. But they were individual and very different stories that were being told. And, it's actually, it's a good place to come in if you're looking to see the versatility of Neil Gaiman as a writer. Because he can go from a more humorous story to a more thought-provoking story. I apologize, Bill. This is going to be hell to edit between my
I'm not
coughs.
editing. It's gonna be too much.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I apologize, listeners, for dropping off periodically so I can hack my brains out. Um, So but it's great. He can go from humorous, he can go to thought provoking, he can go from fantasy and slight horror. Like it's really good, versatile range of his ability as an author. And then I went from that, and while I was reading Kindly Ones, started going back to the beginning and picking up the original volumes. And yeah, if you start with the first one, um, it was when I think that Gaiman was still kind of feeling out what he could do with with the character, and also feeling out how his character's relationship to the DC universe would go, because this is prior. He started prior to Vertigo.
Yeah.
It was
And
still DC.
honestly, when he does incorporate elements of the DC universe, like Lyta, like Hector, like Matt Cable becoming the Raven, um, it was those ties that I felt strengthened the Sandman narrative at
Oh
points.
sure. Oh
Yeah,
yeah. I think
yeah. I think we've talked about this on the show before.
Oh
You
yeah,
know
where
like,
he's with his testing the waters and having Element Girl be one of the characters,
mhm,
and that actually is one of my favorite stories from
yeah.
Fables and Reflections.
Heartbreaking though.
Oh,
Heartbreaking though. Oh,
oh yeah,
yeah.
that and the diner. I mean,
Yeah.
those two stories. If you had never read a Neil Gaiman story before
Yeah.
or Sandman comic, when you hit those two issues or those two chapters, that does it right
Yeah,
there.
and that's something that I think people forget about Sandman is there are some done in ones in the mix, and some of them are very effective stories like Ramadan
Oh yeah.
and the Serial Killers Convention. I forget the name of that one. Um,
Well, that I thought was part of was that part of Doll's House?
no, it's later.
No, that's right, but it does have Rose
It's
Walker.
later. It's yeah, it's close though. It may be like the third volume, whatever is after. I forget where things fall.
Yeah, it's the one that
Um,
introduces the Corinthian for those of you
yeah.
who.
So there is tie-ins with that, but that also stands on its own as its own story. Um, at least to my recollection. I know that there are strands that go after that, but the convention itself is contained within one issue. Um,
The serial convention.
yeah, yeah. So there are these effective done in ones sprinkled out. The Prez story as well.
Yes. Well,
Yeah, which
and if you think about it, that was one of the first stories that I read
yeah.
from Sandman.
So and also with Neil Gaiman, I think he's an example of a writer that does have a queer sensibility without being queer. Uh, that comes through in some of his work. The other artists, the other writers that I think you can say this about are Grant Morrison and Dean Haspiel, and to some extent Greg Rucka, depending upon the project that he's on.
Yeah.
That there is, uh, though these are hetero men, there is well Dean Haspiel's history, with him being raised by two lesbians. Um, that there is a queer sensibility and a queer knowledge. I just think they're very well informed writers. Let's put it that way.
It's
Yeah,
comprehension of
yeah,
what it is to be queer that I think is hard for somebody who's not queer, but it's not impossible. I mean, like you just named off several authors that have that ability and can pull that off. Gail Simone's another one, I think. But I mean, you do have
and
authors there who
and
are.
the Hernandez brothers as well. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
it's like,
Oh
I mean,
gosh.
though I don't lump them in the mainstream as much as I do, apart from Haspiel, some of the other uh, writers that we've mentioned. Um, when you're reading some of those Love and Rocket stories, sometimes you forget that this is not, a queer dyke in Los Angeles writing this.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, so that's just one observation I felt important to provide
Cool.
there. Yeah. Yeah, wow. So it's hard to not talk about heroes, man,
It
because we had
is. I
such a
know.
good time and it was just so great having everybody together.
We
But
have
we'll
to
get
save
to
that.
it.
Yeah, we have to
Yeah,
save that for when we've got Brian on the show.
yeah. But
So
it's also like I'm just thinking about this and like I only saw you 4 days ago. You know?
I know it was just this
four
past weekend.
days ago, you were dropping me off at that Charlotte airport, and I was waving goodbye.
Waving.
Yeah.
It was
And it's
before
also
I.
frustrating because I was presented with an opportunity to go to Charlotte for work next week that I had to say no to, which killed me. So it could have been next Wednesday we were hanging out for a few hours.
Which would have been a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
yeah,
So, oh well.
yeah.
Oh well.
Oh well. So, any books that you've been reading that you want to talk about? One of the frustrating things about comic book conventions is the one thing you don't do is read comics. There's just no time for it.
Well,
But yeah, but are there any books you want to talk about?
I do, and it's actually something that I did pick up at Heroes, and immediately read as soon as I was home. So, and it's a book called Woman World that was actually it was released in 2018, and I believe I want to say that it kind of started out, sort of as a series of sketches and a series of, maybe single page strips that were collected into a single OGN here, original graphic novel. The author and artist Aminder Dhaliwal imagined a world where all men, or all male-identifying people, died out. So it's post-apocalyptic, but unlike other post-apocalyptic books with similar premises, it's funny and it's heartwarming and it's sweet. It's actually it's not grim, dark, and gruesome. It actually takes the idea that even in sort of a devastated landscape where there are excuse me there are no men left, and she makes sure to be very specific that everyone left is female identifying, so it is inclusive of trans women. But there are no men, male identifying people left. They've all died off due to a genetic defect. And it focuses on a small community of women and several of those women within that community, and just their daily lives. And it's funny. There are some great puns, some great little gags, some visual gags. The youngest member of the community, this little girl, she comes to her grandmother so excited because she's discovered an artifact from the old world, and has never seen a man before. And she comes up to her and says, "Oh my gosh, is this a man? This must be, this is amazing, this amazing find." And the grandmother looks at it, and it's a copy of Paul Blart Mall Cop on DVD, and does not have the heart to tell her granddaughter that it's a piece of trash. Apologies to anybody who loved Paul Blart. And just says, "Yes, sweetie. Yes, that's an image of a well-respected man." um, and that ends up being a running gag throughout the book, that the little girl starts idolizing Paul Blart, just based on the image alone. And then also the mayor of the town is a woman who's also a naturist, so she's naked the entire time. And that's also a little bit of a joke because she's like, I just feel free and open, so I'm just going to be naked all the time. And there's one point where she puts on clothes and everybody comes running and it's like, "What's wrong with her? What's wrong with her? She looks so weird." But it's a great, fun, relatively quick. It's about, I'd say maybe about 250 pages altogether, but it's a quick read. But it's so wonderful and so fun to go through and kind of imagine along with Dhaliwal sort of what this world would be like without men. And obviously, the idea of like, well, there won't be any population anymore. That's kind of dealt with very very simply, so that you don't have this sense of impending doom kind of flowing behind things. It's still very light, still very loving, and I would recommend for everybody. And of course, there's in a world of all women, there are a lot of queer relationships that are featured in the book, and they're featured very realistically. Given the environment and the circumstances, I think they actually do a great job of Dhaliwal does a great job of presenting, the difficulties of having an unrequited love, not seeing what's in front of you, that kind of thing, are done very well. And of course, they also do touch on trans identification in a very interesting and subtle way. So I'm not going to give away that. But yeah, the book is Woman World, and the author is Aminder Dhaliwal.
Okay. Well, the book that I picked up at Heroes that I want everyone to know about is a book called Comic Book Implosion, and it's published by Tomorrows, who are known for their I wish we were editing. Sorry, folks, these things happen. Who are known for their books regarding comic book history, pretty much. And in 1978, DC experimented with expanding the page count of their line, across the board, their entire line, and they named the initiative the DC Explosion. And for each of the regular monthly titles, you were getting 8 extra pages of content. For the most part, they were backup stories of some books like say Justice League of America or Legion or the Warlord. They just had, they just basically expanded the main story, but a lot of backups that were coming into the books, and it was so exciting because God, when this hit, I was still 10 years old, you know, reading comic books, about to become 11, having a blast. Comics, becoming, being my life apart from Star Wars. And in 3 months, it was all over.
Mm.
And this was one of the first times where the executives at Warner Brothers, who had purchased the company just a few years before, pushed some directives that killed plans. A number of creators and editorial staff were let go. The page counts went from 25 back to 17. There were only 20 monthly titles published and 6 bi-monthly titles published. That was their entire line.
Wow.
And in the narrative of the comic book implosion, it tells a story of what happened before, what happened that affected the decision to where the explosion was over, and it commonly became known first in the comic book press world and just in the general vernacular as the DC implosion, and what happened afterwards, not just the material, because so much material had been prepared for this expansion. Some of it had a home in literally a Xerox copy of a book called Cancel Comics Cavalcade, which lasted 2 issues, which were just internally distributed among DC staff, and nowadays go for a couple $1,000s if you can find a verified copy. Though it's all online, folks. It's all online. And, how certain relationships were affected, things I never knew about. I never knew that DC's publisher Jeanette Kahn and artist Neil Adams were an item for a couple years. Never knew that, and I know a lot. I mean, that's not bragging. I know a lot about comics history. So, this book I also think is very important because some of these people that are being interviewed are in their 70s, and we're going to be losing some of these people naturally within the next 20 years. And to get that firsthand perspective and sometimes contradictory stories about how things went down, it's fascinating. I'm about halfway through the book. It was really tough for me this morning to put it down and actually get to work on time. So that's a mark of a good book. And the writers are Keith Dallas, who, from what I understand, actually went to school at Delaware around the same time that I did, and John Wells. And again, from Tomorrow's, it's called Comic Book Implosion. And if you go to Amazon right now, it is 41% off at just $12.86.
Wow.
So
I might pick
so
one
that's so that's the book I want to talk about. And also, if this was not the period of comic books that you were aware of, I don't think your enjoyment of it would be affected at all. I don't think you had to be a comic fan specifically of the time that they were documenting within the book, I think there are some stories that you hear time again. Some of the characters in the stories were part of the first instances of DC, and this is something that Jeanette Kahn had brought in, of royalties and participation in licensing monies and for creators and stuff like that. So I think there are some universal concepts that affect comic books from their inception to the present day that you can sink your teeth into within the narrative. So that's something I think people should check out. The entire full title is Comic Book Implosion: An Oral History of DC Comics circa 1978. So that's what I'm reading.
Cool.
All right. Well, again, we wanted to get you this Pride Quickie out to you. That's it. Pride Quickie. That's the name of the episode.
That works. That works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for most people, I think a Pride Quickie is something else, but that's what we're going to talk about here. Oh, we're so funny and we're so gay. All right. When we wrap up an episode of the Comic Book Bears, we do so with a segment we call the Wolves of the Week segment, which is where we spotlight something, be it a comic book, charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, may be interested in sampling. Steve, let me throw it over to you. What is your Wolf of the Week?
Well, of course, it's TV related.
Mm-hmm.
HBO just came out with a new series. It's part of their new "We Don't Just Make Game of Thrones and We're Not Collapsing Because It's Over" initiative, and that is Euphoria. And Euphoria, if you're familiar with the British series Skins, it has a very similar feel. These are teenagers who are the main characters who are sort of navigating a life where they have a little bit of privilege and some money. They're in a, I would say, middle class, middle upper class community where they have access to drugs, where they have access to, a lot of opportunities for sex. And of course, this is 2019, so there's a lot more accessibility overall. And it features Zendaya as the main character, who has just gotten out of rehab, and of course immediately goes back to drugs. And it features friends or people in her orbit, in her school orbit, and the situations that they get themselves into. So it's, again, it runs the gamut from humor to, I would say, extremely uncomfortable situations, in the vein of Kids, if you remember that from the early 90s.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, yeah. And like I mentioned, Skins as well, if you're familiar with that relatively long-running UK series. But Zendaya is amazing. Of a lot of that sort of, the current generation of, pop stars / actors, some of whom came up from the Disney stable or the Nickelodeon stable, I think she's got just a real ability to draw the viewer in, and she does an amazing job. Just kind of pulling in this nihilistic, almost defeatist kind of performance, while also making you sympathize with her, because she does some pretty terrible things in it, but you still are rooting for her to maybe, turn her life around or to snap out of it and not make these terrible decisions. But there is a trans character who's featured, a young trans character, trans girl, trans woman, that has a very interesting encounter with McSteamy. I forget the guy's name, the actual actor's name, but McSteamy from Grey's Anatomy. That will change your perspective of him if you've watched this. So, excuse me, again, I apologize to everybody who's listening to me cough, but the show is Euphoria. It airs on Sunday nights in that time slot from Game of Thrones that obviously, again, is over, but HBO has not collapsed into a heaping pile of crying executives yet. So, Euphoria.
Okay. There's a book I'm dying to talk about, but it's not being released to August, so it's not fair. And it's a book that I gave Steve a copy of as well. So folks, you're gonna have to wait till August to hear about this one book that I'm dying to talk about. But I'm gonna talk about a web comic. How about that? And the web
Excellent.
comic I'm going to be talking about, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this, is Check Please.
No.
Okay, well, you might want to check this out. Let me
Ooh.
tell you about this because it is an LGBTQIA themed webcomic. Um, it started in 2013. It's a manga style book, which is written and illustrated by Ngozi Okazu. Don't let the name fool you, though. She is actually an African American woman. And Check Please tells the story of a college ice hockey player named Eric Biddle. Everybody calls him Biddy. And throughout the story, he is coming to terms with his identity as a gay man, and also with his feelings for other men on the team. And instead of something where there's it's almost as if the entire story is joyous. It really focuses on some of the best parts of your college experiences, like your friendships and the inside jokes that you have among your friends, and the roommate frustrations that when you step back are really funny. There's this sweetness to this, and also with the main characters being part of a hockey team. Um, there's this camaraderie that it just taps into so many great things about the team experience and the college experience, and like I said, there's just a sweetness to this that it's really hard to describe until you get into it, and then once you do, you'll know right off the bat what I'm talking about. Um, the members of the team, some of them are hysterical. There's a member that they nicknamed Shitty, and he is shitty because of his cockiness. There's a female team manager, which I think is another very interesting twist on the collegiate sports element. Biddy ends up again, the main character ends up with a steady boyfriend as time goes on, and also there's these short intermissions called hockey shit with Ransom and Holster. Ransom and Holster are these two basically inseparable bros on the team that make up for some of the more funny elements to the story, and you get some education about hockey within this overall narrative. It is being published in book form now. The first volume is out. It is published by, let me just get the name right. I was right. First Second Books, which is a subsidiary of Macmillan. A second volume is coming out next year, but again, the regularly updated webcomic is available for however you want it and whenever you want it. And again, that's checkpleasecomic.com.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm actually reading some of it right now, and yes, it is hilarious. You need to eat more protein, bitch. You did not. And actually, I do have to say, in terms of how they, how she presents the webcomic, it takes advantage of, certain things that you can really only do on the web. Some blinking effects, sort of like slideshow kind of effects and things like that. So I think I like it. I like the format.
Yeah, I think as you go on, you'll keep digging it. I started with this on Tuesday from a off the cuff remark by a coworker. Oh, this was webcomic I used to read a few years ago. I think you'd like it, and I dedicated like a couple of hours going through the archive. And at some point soon, I'm going to order the book because I like to have that texture and feeling.
Hmm.
And to see how it reads there, because as you said, there are some effects, and it's not locked to a comic strip form. There are some. Oh boy, you're coughing. I burped as we go through. So this is no frills episode, folks, on our Pride Quickie. Uh, so I'll say it once again. Check pleasecomic.com. And also, just as a creator, this is one creator I would love to talk to. Maybe we should try to pursue that at some point because it feels as if she had this this conception just completely ironed out from the first panel, and we're just benefiting from that conception as this goes along. The last time I felt like that is something was Calvin and Hobbes, where
Yeah.
it was just it was just fully formed from the word go. There's not a Calvin and Hobbes vibe to it. I'm not saying that, but just that feeling of it being born fully realized in a sense. I had that feeling by the third panel. So checkplease.com. That was my wolf of the week. All right, folks. Again, this is the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. If you want to write to us, you can do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. And if you want to listen to us, you can do so through iTunes. If you are listening to us through iTunes, please provide a review. Would greatly appreciate that. You can also listen to us through Stitcher Radio and some of the other podcatching platforms. Until next time, I'm Billy Z.
And I'm Steve Morey.
You're going to hear a woof and an explosion and probably a cough and a burp in there, and we'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone.
Woof!
Everybody loses it. Everybody wants to throw it all away sometimes. And hey, yeah, I know what you're going through. Don't let it get the best of you. You'll make it out alive. Oh, people like us, we gotta stick together. Keep your head up, nothing lasts forever.